a crown stolen in an act of revenge. A betrayal that would set a dangerous precedent, leading to decades of bloodshed. The Wars of the Roses didn't just begin on a battlefield. You could say they began right here, with one king's greed and his cousin's quest for what was rightfully his. Out of the chaos and violence of the late Middle Ages, one family rose to seize control of England, only to tear itself apart. Before the battles and the slaughter, there was a single moment. A political gamble that created a fatal crack in the foundation of the English monarchy. This is the story of a king who took too much, and the son of a duke who would return to take everything. So, to understand the fire, you first have to understand the friction that sparked it. In the late 14th century, England was ruled by a man who believed he was more than a man, King Richard II. He was the grandson of the legendary warrior king Edward III. But where Edward commanded respect through strength, Richard demanded it as a divine right. He saw himself as God's chosen representative on earth, a belief that colored his every decision and tolerated no dissent. His court was a glittering spectacle of high culture, but beneath the velvet and gold, paranoia was festering. Richard surrounded himself with a tight circle of favorites, lavishing them with wealth while viewing the powerful, established nobility with deep suspicion. He didn't rule as the first among equals. He had an autocratic style that was dangerously at odds with the fiercely independent barons of England. And in the shadows of this glittering court stood a figure of immense power, John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster. Gaunt was everything Richard wasn't. As the fourth son of Edward III, he was a seasoned statesman, a respected military commander, and thanks to his marriage to the heiress Blanche of Lancaster, the richest man in England, his wealth was staggering. His private army of retainers could rival the king's own, and his influence was often a steadying hand on the kingdom. In many ways, while Richard was king by title, John of Gaunt was the embodiment of royal power. He acted as a mediator between the increasingly tyrannical king and the disgruntled nobility, a living link to the glorious past of his father's reign. This dynamic was a political powder keg. On one side, you had a king convinced of his elevated power, but deeply insecure about the mighty nobles who could challenge him. On the other, a duke of almost limitless influence, whose very existence was a quiet reminder of the king's own limitations. The first real cracks in the kingdom's foundation had appeared years earlier. In the 1380s, a group of powerful nobles, the Lords Appellant, rose up to curb Richard's power and remove his unpopular favorites. Among them was Gaunt's own son, the bold and ambitious Henry Bolingbroke. This confrontation was a humiliation for Richard, one he would never forgive. He was forced to bow to the power of his nobles, and he spent the next decade quietly rebuilding his authority, waiting for the day he could exact his revenge. That day was coming, and it would set in motion a chain of events far more brutal and astonishing than anything you'll find in fiction. The personal animosity between King Richard and his cousin, Henry Bolingbroke, was the engine of the coming chaos. Henry, son of John of Gaunt, had inherited his father's charisma and his family's pride. He was a celebrated knight, renowned in tournaments across Europe, a man who projected an aura of competence that was a stark contrast to his cousin, the king. It's likely that Richard saw in Henry not just a rival, but a reflection of his own insecurities. The simmering feud erupted into public view in 1398, before the entire court. Henry Bolingbroke made a shocking accusation. He charged Thomas de Mowbray, the Duke of Norfolk, with treason. Henry claimed Mowbray had embezzled royal funds and had confessed to plotting against the king. Mowbray furiously denied it, and the two powerful dukes, once allies, now stood as mortal enemies. They demanded the right to settle it in the traditional way, a trial by combat, a duel to the death. Richard agreed, and the stage was set at Coventry for a bloody showdown. The great lords gathered, the two combatants entered the lists in full armor, lances poised. The air crackled with anticipation. And then, at the very last second, just as the charge was about to begin, King Richard threw down his staff, halting the duel. The crowd was stunned. This wasn't an act of mercy. It was a cold, calculated display of power. Richard, acting as judge and jury, delivered a sentence that shocked the kingdom. He didn't declare a winner. Instead, he punished both men.
Act, die.
Thomas de Mowbray was exiled for life. And Henry Bolingbroke, his own cousin, the heir to the vast Lancastrian fortune, was banished for 10 years. It was a masterful, tyrannical move. With one decision, Richard had removed two of the most powerful and troublesome figures from his realm without a single drop of blood being shed. But as Henry prepared for his exile, Richard made him a solemn promise, guaranteed by oaths. He assured Henry that while he was gone, his inheritance would be protected. The immense wealth of the Duchy of Lancaster would be waiting for him. Henry had little choice but to accept the king's word. As he sailed away from England, leaving behind his home, his titles, and his children, he clung to that promise. It was a promise Richard had absolutely no intention of keeping. In February 1399, John of Gaunt, the great Duke of Lancaster, died. His death was more than a personal loss. It was a political earthquake. For years, Gaunt had been the buffer, the elder statesman who could temper his nephew Richard's worst impulses. With him gone, the last real restraint on the king's greed and paranoia was removed. Richard now saw his chance. He desperately needed money for a military campaign in Ireland. And before him lay the greatest private fortune in the kingdom, the inheritance of the exiled Henry Bolingbroke. The king's solemn oath now seemed like a foolish inconvenience. In an act of breathtaking arrogance, Richard did the unthinkable. He convened his council and, through a series of legal maneuvers, declared his previous promises void. He cancelled the documents that allowed Bolingbroke to claim his inheritance from abroad and, with a stroke of a pen, seized the entire Duchy of Lancaster for the crown. To complete the destruction of his rival, he then extended Henry's exile from 10 years to life. Henry Bolingbroke was now not just an exile. He was a landless, disinherited traitor. How could a king make such a catastrophic miscalculation? To us, it might just look like simple greed. But in the 14th century, this was an attack on the very fabric of the feudal world. The right of inheritance was sacred. It was the principle that guaranteed the lands and titles of every noble family in England. By disinheriting Henry, Richard sent a terrifying message: none of you are safe. If the king can erase the rights of the heir of Lancaster, a man of royal blood, then anyone's lands could be forfeit at the king's whim. This was the foundational betrayal. It wasn't just an injustice against one man. It was a declaration of war on the established order. The very barons Richard relied on now looked at their king with fear and mistrust. In his desperate grab for cash and his desire to crush a rival, Richard had alienated the one group of men he couldn't afford to make his enemy. He had given them a cause. Now, all that was needed was for an avenger to return. Across the Channel in Paris, news of the betrayal reached Henry Bolingbroke. He was a man with nothing left to lose. His father was dead, his land stolen, his honor impugned. But Richard had underestimated his cousin. He hadn't broken Henry's spirit. He had forged it into a weapon of pure resolve. Framing his return as a righteous quest, Henry announced his intention to come back to England, not as a would-be king, but as a wronged man seeking what was lawfully his, the Duchy of Lancaster. The late June 1399, while King Richard was distracted on a campaign in Ireland, Henry saw his moment. He landed at Ravenspur on the Yorkshire coast with a small, almost insignificant force of loyal followers. It was a desperate gamble, but one that paid off with astonishing speed. Henry's claim to be seeking only his inheritance was a masterful piece of propaganda. The disaffected lords of northern England, led by the powerful Percy family, saw in Henry not a usurper, but a champion of their own rights. They flocked to his banner, and his small band of exiles swelled into a formidable army. What began as a personal quest for justice quickly snowballed into a national uprising. As Henry marched south, town after town, castle after castle, opened its gates to him. He wasn't seen as a rebel, but as a liberator. The man left to rule in Richard's absence, the Duke of York, found himself powerless as his own soldiers deserted to join Henry's cause. Meanwhile, King Richard remained trapped in Ireland, delayed by storms. By the time he finally landed in Wales, it was too late. His kingdom had abandoned him. His armies melted away, and he found himself isolated and hunted. The end was an anticlimax. Richard surrendered, promising to give up the throne in exchange for his life. Henry escorted his captive cousin to London, with crowds cheering for the returning hero. Henry Bolingbroke had returned to England to reclaim a duchy. But the overwhelming support he received presented him with a far greater prize: the crown itself. On October 13, 1399, with the deposed Richard imprisoned, Henry Bolingbroke was crowned King Henry IV, the first king of the House of Lancaster. He had avenged the betrayal. But as he would soon find out, a crown won by force sits uneasily on the head. The crown was on his head, but Henry IV quickly discovered that seizing power and holding it are two very different things. His claim to the throne was ... complicated. By a strict, modern reading of primogeniture, he wasn't the rightful heir. That claim belonged to the young Edmund Mortimer, a descendant of Edward III's second son, while Henry was descended from the third. Henry had taken the throne through a combination of conquest, popular acclaim, and parliamentary approval. But his usurpation set a dangerous precedent that a king could be unmade. This act would become the original sin of the House of Lancaster, a stain of illegitimacy that could never be truly washed away. His reign was immediately plagued by instability. He spent the next 13 years facing constant challenges and lurching from one rebellion to the next. Within months, a group of Richard's loyalists launched the Epiphany Rising, a failed attempt to assassinate Henry. Henry crushed the plot, and shortly thereafter, the deposed King Richard died in Pontefract Castle, under deeply suspicious circumstances, a dark secret that would haunt the new king. But the rebellions kept coming. In Wales, a charismatic leader named Owain Glyndŵr led a fierce, decade-long war for independence. And in England, Henry's most powerful allies, the Percy family, felt they had been inadequately rewarded for helping him get the throne. They turned on him, joining forces with the Welsh in a massive rebellion that climaxed at the bloody Battle of Shrewsbury in 1403. At Shrewsbury, Henry IV fought for his life and his crown. His own son, the future Henry V, was struck in the face with an arrow and nearly killed. Though Henry won the battle, the message was clear: a kingdom built on betrayal is a kingdom that breeds betrayers. The man who had been the dashing Henry Bolingbroke became a weary, paranoid, and chronically ill king. He had won the ultimate prize, but found no peace. By deposing an anointed king, he had secured the throne for the Lancastrians, but he had also violently opened up the question of who had the better right to rule. It was a question that would not be settled for nearly 100 years. In the end, Henry IV succeeded in passing the crown to his son. And that son, the heroic Henry V, temporarily plaster over the cracks in the dynasty's foundation with his legendary victories in France, most famously at Agincourt. For a brief, glorious moment, it seemed the Lancastrian gamble had paid off. The stolen crown seemed secure. But the original sin of 1399 was not so easily erased. Henry V's tragically early death left the throne to his infant son, Henry VI. This new king was a gentle, pious man who suffered from debilitating bouts of mental illness and was ill-suited for the brutal politics of the age. It was under his weak rule that the seeds of conflict sown by his grandfather would finally bear their bitter fruit. The descendants of Edward III's other sons, the House of York, would rise to challenge Lancastrian rule. They used arguments about their superior bloodline, exploiting the very question of legitimacy that Henry Bolingbroke's own actions had created. The act of revenge for a stolen inheritance ultimately became the justification for a civil war that tore the kingdom apart for 3 decades, a dynastic struggle we now call the Wars of the Roses. The story of the Wars of the Roses is the story of this poisoned legacy. If you want to discover how the heroic triumphs of Henry V gave way to the disastrous reign of Henry VI, and how the rival House of York rose to challenge the Lancastrian crown on the bloody battlefields of St. Albans and Towton, make sure you subscribe and hit the notification bell for our next chapter in England's Bloodiest dynasty.